but you'll see the kind of context I'm more used to addressing in the UK. It seems to me that one cannot deny that we live in a time of very serious ecological crisis. We live at a time when it has at last become obvious that humans are so dominant on Earth that we can destroy the very conditions of our own continued life and flourishing on the planet, not to mention those of many other species. Not only can we do that, we are doing it in ways that we can sum up under two main headings: the mass extinction of other species and human-induced climate change. I'm not going to elaborate now on what those massive changes in the world around us consist in. I take it you know enough to be going on with. But clearly what we are facing is a crisis in our relationships as humans to the rest of the natural world. The environment, as it's often called, I prefer in a theological context to speak of God's creation. Humans are part of God's creation, members of the great community of God's creatures on this planet. How did we get into this mess? Is it just a matter of human greed and stupidity? Or does the ecological crisis have ideological roots? Is our destructive and disastrous treatment of the rest of creation rooted in ideas about the natural world and our place in it, a way of viewing the world that has characterized modern Western societies and has given permission, as it were, for arrogance, greed, and sheer stupidity to do their damage, and more than that, an ideology that has actually mandated the ruthless and unlimited exploitation of nature for human good. Now, in the Green movement, there has been a strong current of opinion that blames it all on Christianity and its Bible. I think, as a result of Christian involvement in ecological concerns, this view is certainly on the decline, but it can still be heard even from people who really should be better informed. On the face of it, the popularity of this idea that the Bible and therefore also Christianity are anti-ecological, bad for the planet, derives from a single article by the medieval historian Lynn White, first published in 1967, called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It is a flimsy article of less than 12 pages, sadly deficient in evidence for its very grand thesis, and so its influence is remarkable. Moreover, as a historical argument, it has been refuted over and over. To go on citing it as some kind of academic authority is inexcusable, but that is still done. Why has it been so popular? Apart from the general tendency of modern secular thinking to blame whatever is supposed to have gone wrong in Western society on Christianity, I think Lynn White's thesis has seemed to have a kind of initial plausibility, simply because so much of Western culture has been formed by the Christian tradition. Isn't it likely that Christianity must be responsible for this major feature of the modern world, its assumption that the rest of nature is there to be exploited for our own use, however we choose? The history is actually quite complex, and I can't rehearse it tonight. But what such a view neglects is that the modern world has its roots in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, as much as it does in the earlier Christian tradition. Certainly it's true that modern people, beginning with the amazingly influential Francis Bacon at the beginning of the 17th century, have read the Bible as authorizing an unlimited exploitation of the natural world. But in doing so, they were responding to the new developments of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. We cannot blame the Bible for all the ways in which Christians have read it over the centuries. In this case, I would say, the first chapter of Genesis was being hijacked by a current of thought that flowed naturally into modern secular humanism. Thankfully, in the last 2 decades especially, Christians have been rediscovering a quite different ecological approach to the Bible. So what are the grounds on which the Bible and Christianity have been judged anti-ecological? What are the charges? It is said that whereas pagan religions reverenced nature as divine, the Bible, with its faith in the one God alone, robbed nature of its sacred character, reducing it to mere stuff that humans can make use of as they wish. It is alleged that, according to Genesis 1, God made the rest of creation for humans and gave humans a mandate to subdue and exploit the rest of creation for human benefit. Humans, it is said, are conceived as fundamentally different from the rest of creation, spiritual beings with an otherworldly destiny, whereas the natural world is a strictly temporary creation through which humans pass on their way to a higher destiny. Christian faith thus encourages detachment from this world, and so Christians have little reason to want to conserve nature. These charges are not entirely wide of the mark, as you may be thinking yourselves. But if we recognise some truth in them, what should we do about it? What Christians have usually done in situations like this, when something seems to have gone wrong in the Christian tradition, is this: they have gone back to the Bible, as of course the Reformation preeminently did. They have looked again at the biblical teaching. Has the Bible been misinterpreted and misunderstood? Has it been read through cultural lenses that have distorted it? So in the rest of the lecture, I want to go back to what the Bible says about creation and our human place in it as God intends it. The first chapter of Genesis has been the major focus of the sort of discussion I've been referring to, and so I shall spend some time on it. Its place at the beginning of Scripture certainly warrants its importance. But I'm also very keen to insist that Genesis 1 is only one of many biblical passages that reflect on the human place in creation. And some of these other passages come at it from a rather different perspective that we need to hold in balance along with Genesis 1. If people had paid more attention to some of the other passages, some of the misunderstandings of Genesis 1 might not have arisen. By the way, I hope you've all got the handout. You'll find it quite helpful from now on, I hope. So let's first take a fresh look at the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1. Now, I do not imagine that Genesis 1 was ever intended to be a literal history of the world, of the way the world came to be. I think that, and to get into that discussion, I think would be a red herring at this point. I want to focus on what it seems to me that Genesis 1 is really doing, and the most important thing it can say to us, is a message about the nature and meaning of God's creation. It is, I think, a richly significant portrayal of what it means to see the world as God's creation. It takes the form of a narrative, because stories, of course, are one of the most effective ways in which the human imagination can grasp meaning. It's the reason, of course, that Jesus told parables. If you look at the diagram on the first page of the handouts, where I've set out the 6 days, kind of summarised the key points from the narrative under each of the 6 days and set them out, as you'll see, in that way. The text, you can see, is actually constructed not only by narrative progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, chronologically, if you like, but it is constructed at least as much also spatially, according to which parts, according to the parts of creation and their inhabitants. So what happens is that God creates on the first 3 days the environments for living creatures, and he names them. On the first day he creates light, so that the sequence of light and darkness, day and night, provides, as it were, a reliable cosmic environment for life. On the second day, God creates the firmament, separates the primeval waters of chaos now above the firmament from the waters below. It's how ancient people thought of the sky. And it's how God, in the narrative, makes space for an inhabitable world, holding back the waters of chaos that would otherwise engulf it. Then on day 3, God creates dry land by gathering the waters on the earth into their own allotted space, the seas, and the earth itself produces the vegetation that makes land a place where animals can live. Well, having created these 3 environments, on the subsequent 3 days, God fills each of the environments in turn and in the same order with inhabitants. On day 4, he creates the heavenly bodies, especially the sun and the moon, putting them in charge of the alternating periods of light and darkness. On day 5, God creates the sea creatures that make their home in the waters of the earth, and the birds that live in the sky above. Finally, on day 6, he creates the creatures who are to populate the land. All kinds of mammals, reptiles and insects. When the Old Testament says creeping things, the usual English translation, creeping things or something like that, they're all kinds of small reptiles and insects and creatures of that kind. Mammals, reptiles, insects, and finally humans. Notice we don't get a day to ourselves, because we too are land animals who must share a common home with other creatures who live on land and from the land. We are, however, distinguished by a unique feature, the image of God, and by a unique role of dominion over other living things. We'll come back to that special role of humanity within creation. But notice that each category of inhabitants created on days 4, 5, and 6 has a God-given task, a task for which God blesses them, and we humans have a task that is in part the same as those of other living creatures, to multiply and to fill their environment, but is also distinctive. The whole account is a very formulaic one, with key phrases repeated over and over. And one of these, a sort of refrain that runs through the account, I've highlighted in the diagram by putting it in italic print. It's God saw that it was good. At the end of his at the end of his work on almost every day of the 6 days of creation, God looks at his work, is satisfied with it, admires it, pronounces it good. At the end of the 6th day, he saw all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. The whole is greater than the parts. It all belongs together, and the finished whole is not just good, but very good. Still, every part of creation, just in itself, is good. It has value for God. I think we can enliven the language a bit here in English. God saw that it was good means God was delighted with it. Among the things that delighted God must be, because it's such a prominent feature of the account, the sheer abundant variety of the creatures. Another recurring formula is the phrase "of every kind" or "according to their kind." We hear of fruit trees of every kind, seed-bearing plants of every kind, sea creatures of every kind, birds of every kind, wild animals of every kind, domestic animals of every kind, creeping things of every kind. In all, that phrase occurs 10 times. In contemporary terms, we would call this biodiversity. This account of creation celebrates biodiversity. It paints a picture of a world teeming with many, many different forms of life. And notice that God blesses the living creatures he creates on days 5 and 6, another recurring formula, and it means he gives them fertility. He enables them to be fruitful and to multiply. So not only diversity, but abundance belong to the Creator's will for his creation. God saw that it was good. The fact that that refrain occurs 6 times before God gets to creating humans makes it unmistakable that God sees all his creatures as intrinsically valuable. Even the environments, they don't have to wait for inhabitants before God pronounces them good. The creatures do not have merely instrumental value for other creatures, and certainly they are not just created for human use. They're good in themselves in God's sight. Nor is there any kind of progression in value as the narrative progresses. I think that's particularly clear when we recognise that the account is spatially constructed according to environments, not according to value, not hierarchically. It would make surely no sense to suppose that, for example, insects created on day 6 are more valuable than birds created in day 5, or that fish are more valuable than the heavenly bodies. So this account does not go along with that modern, not really scientific view of evolution as an ascending scale that culminates in humans. Humans are special in Genesis 1, and the fact that we come last is not without significance, as we'll see. But we are not special because we stand at the top of some ascending scale of value. It simply doesn't make sense of the text. It seems to me that the refrain, God saw that it was good, functions to invite us, the readers, to share God's delight. At each stage of the narrative of creation, we are invited to pause and appreciate. God saw that it was good, says to us, "Do you see how good it is? isn't it awe-inspiring? Doesn't it stir you to pleasure and gratitude? So when we get partway through day 6 and learn about our special responsibility for creation, which is what I think the dominion over other creatures is, we come to it with an appreciation for creation, a recognition of how valuable it is to God, and a corresponding evaluation of our own, with a deep sense of gratitude to God for the manifold wonders of his world. After that, we can surely not read our special task as a license to exploit, to lay waste, and to destroy the rest of creation. Well, it's time to take a closer look at what God says to the newly created humans. Genesis 1:28, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Now, it's not often well enough noticed that this actually consists of two rather different matters. It refers first to the relationship of humans to the earth, secondly, to the relationship of humans to other living creatures. Having dominion over other living creatures is not the same thing as subduing the earth. Let's take our relationship to the earth first, remembering that, of course, all creatures live from their environment. Many creatures make changes to their environment in order to live from it. And to that extent, humans are no different from others. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Humans are not alone in being told to be fruitful and multiply and to fill. The fish are to multiply and fill the sea. The birds are to multiply on earth. And although the text is not explicit, we must assume that the creatures of the land are also to be fruitful and multiply. However, only humans are told to fill the earth and to subdue the earth. And those two things, I think, go together, because it was only by means of agriculture that humans were able to fill the world, to live in at least a large proportion of the available land space. To subdue the earth is to take possession and to work the soil in order to make it yield more food for humans than it would do simply of its own accord. But what about all the other land animals? Are humans to fill the earth at their expense? Are humans supposed to supplant them? Well, God continues in this way, Genesis 1:29, speaking to humans still. "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them as food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." Why does God tell humans that he's given every plant for food to the other living creatures? Why doesn't he say this to the animals themselves? It's not because they won't understand him, because in verse 22 God has already spoken to the sea creatures and to the birds. The convention of the account is that God can speak to any creatures. Why has he said this to humans? Surely it's because humans need to know this. They need to know that the produce of the earth is not intended to feed humans alone, but also all the living species of the earth. Humans are not to fill the earth and subdue it to the extent of leaving no room and no sustenance for the other creatures who share the earth with them. God has given them too the right to live from the soil. So the human right to make use of the earth, to live from it, is not unlimited. Far from it. It must respect the rights of other creatures. Incidentally, humans now appropriate about 40% of the planet's organic matter produced by photosynthesis in green plants. What then of the task of dominion over other creatures? This idea of dominion, an enormously influential idea historically, and variously interpreted over the centuries, is what more than anything has tempted people who knew the text to forget their own creatureliness, to set themselves over the rest of creation as though they did not belong to it, but could do as they wished with it, even remake it to their own design. But this is only possible if we take it out of its biblical context. In Genesis 1, dominion is a role within creation, not over it. Other creatures are first and foremost our fellow creatures, and only when we appreciate them as such can we properly exercise the distinctive role the Genesis creation narrative gives us in relation to other creatures. It's not the only way we relate to other creatures, but it is a distinctive one. The word that has become familiar to many Christians today as a term to express what the dominion means is stewardship. And this has been appropriated also by some other environmentalists as well as Christians. I prefer the term caring responsibility for a number of reasons. One reason is that Genesis depicts the dominion as a kind of royal function. And the ideal king in the biblical tradition is the good shepherd who takes care of the creatures for whom he has responsibility. To those who think that any idea of a human position of responsibility for other creatures is an arrogant presumption, I would say that it is a straightforward fact that humans are the dominant species on Earth. We do have the power to influence the fate of most other creatures. To pretend otherwise is surely to shirk responsibility. Genesis bids us use our exceptional power not carelessly and exploitatively, but as a matter of caring responsibility for other creatures. A final point to notice about the human dominion is this, that the world has a created order that we humans have to respect. One reason, I think, why the Genesis account has such a carefully structured literary order is to convey the impression of a cosmos that is carefully ordered by God, its creator. And in the narrative, this order is already established, of course, before the creation of humans. The human dominion is not granted so that humans may violate that order and remake creation to their own design. It is not our task, as some versions of stewardship have suggested, to put a chaotic world into order. The world has its own order, as science, of course, abundantly confirms. Genesis 1 takes for granted that the God-given order of the world must be respected by the human exercise of limited dominion within it. Too often, our attempts to create order have produced only chaos. So to summarise what I've said about Genesis 1, and you have these points on the handout. First of all, the world is not anthropocentric. It's not all created simply for human use. God values and delights in all the manifold variety of his innumerable creatures. Second, humans have the right to make use of their environment in order to survive and to flourish. But they do not have an exclusive right. We share the world with other creatures of God. We must, as it were, leave room for them to flourish too. Thirdly, humans have a unique role of caring responsibility for other living creatures. But it is a role to be exercised within creation, a role that we exercise not as demigods over creation, but as creatures in relation to our fellow creatures. And fourthly, the world has a God-given order which requires our respect. Again, we are not demigods with a godlike ability to recreate the world as we may wish. We are creatures, marvellously gifted and extraordinarily competent creatures, but creatures nonetheless. We must work with the created order of the world. We must work with the created order of the world, not against it. So much for Genesis 1. In my introduction to the lecture, I was critical of the way that so much interpretation of that crucial bit of Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28, isolates it from the rest of Genesis 1, to say nothing else, but also from the rest of Scripture and the relevance that other parts of Scripture may have for understanding the human relationship with other creatures. One danger of isolating Genesis 1 relates to what I call the vertical and the horizontal aspects of our relationship with other creatures. By that I mean the vertical is the sense in which we are set over other creatures, the horizontal is the sense in which we are fellow creatures with other creatures under God, as it were. Far too many readings of Genesis 1 have emphasized only the vertical relationship, the sense that we are set over the rest of creation, as in some sense rulers over other creatures. I've tried to show how important it is to keep in view also our horizontal relationship as creatures of God with other creatures of God. The vertical only works properly when we remember the horizontal. When we forget the horizontal, we begin to forget that we're creatures at all, and we aspire to the role of God over the creation. Now, in the rest of the lecture, I want to introduce you to two other major biblical themes that I think deserve our attention alongside the Genesis dominion, and which come into view when we look to other parts of the Bible. They're themes that help to put the Genesis dominion in its place as one of the ways in which we are related to other creatures, but not the only way. And crucially, in my view, these other two themes develop what I've called the horizontal relationship of humans to others as fellow creatures. So they help us to balance the vertical with the horizontal. So, more briefly, something about these two other themes. What I've done on the handout is to set out on page 3 the three biblical themes. The dominion is the one I've talked about. I'm going on to say something about the other two. So the first of these I call humanity within the community of creation. My book, Bible and Ecology, which is the first of my two books in this area, has as its subtitle, Rediscovering the Community of Creation. And that, I think, is what we urgently need to do, to rediscover ourselves as creatures within the community of God's creatures on earth. The Bible, I think, fully recognises the extent to which nature is a living whole, to which human beings, along with other creatures, belong, sharing the earth with other creatures of God, participating for good or ill in the interconnectedness of the whole creation. A notable text still within Genesis, still within the early part of Genesis, where the author is kind of setting up what the world is like in very general terms before he gets to Abraham, is in Genesis 9, where after the flood, God makes a covenant not only with Noah and his family, but also with all living creatures. All living creatures are partners to this covenant. And the covenant, of course, enshrines God's promise not to destroy the world in a universal deluge again. And it's for the sake of all living creatures that God makes that promise. They all have a stake in the covenant. So God, as it were, makes that covenant with the whole community of creation in which we stand alongside other creatures. Psalm 104, the great creation psalm. Psalm 104, I think, provides a wonderful picture of the creation as a community of many living creatures, each with their own place in the world, given them by God, each given by God the means of sustenance for their different forms of life. In this context, humans are treated, actually in just one verse, verse 23, simply as one of the many kinds of living creatures for whom God provides. And Psalm 104 is one of several biblical passages that state that God provides for all his living creatures. Psalm 147, Job 38, and that theme is taken up by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:26. And in all those passages, I think there is the implication that the resources of the earth are sufficient for all, provided they live within created limits. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount compares humanity with the birds and the wildflowers, appealing to the fact that God provides for all his creatures, the effect is to discourage the excessive desires and the unrestrained consumption by humans that are presently destroying the earth as a habitat for all creatures. The second biblical theme that I suggest we set alongside the notion of dominion is quite closely related to the idea of the community of creation. And I think in a way this is the most important of all the Bible's ways of placing us humans among the creatures rather than over them. And this is the theme of all creation's worship of God. There are many passages in the Psalms. I've given you the most obvious passages there, and Psalm 148 is the great psalm devoted to this theme. Passages that depict all of God's creatures worshipping God. And the theme is taken up also in the New Testament. Passage we spoke about in relation to Christology in Philippians 2, but you remember that the passage ends with all creatures in heaven and earth and under the earth acknowledging Jesus as Lord to the glory of God the Father. All creatures, animate and inanimate, according to the Bible, worship God. Now, modern biblical interpreters, I think, have too readily supposed that this is some kind of poetic fancy, which doesn't really mean very much, or some kind of primitive animism that thinks of all creatures as having consciousness. I think those are misleading approaches and fail to take these texts seriously. The other creatures bring glory to God in ways appropriate to the kinds of creatures they are. They worship God just by being themselves, by being what God made them to be, existing for the glory of God. Only humans fail to worship God. Other creatures, without having to think about it, worship God all the time. Now we should notice, I think, that there is, it seems to me, no indication at all in the Bible of the idea that the other creatures need us in order to voice their praise for them. This idea, often expressed as the idea that we are supposed to act as priests to the rest of nature, mediating, as it were, between nature and God, is found in quite a lot of, I don't want to exaggerate it, in some recent Christian writing, especially inspired by the Orthodox tradition. But in my view, it intrudes our inveterate sense of superiority exactly where the Bible does not allow it. If anything, it seems we should think of the rest of creation assisting us in our worship. In Psalm 148, you have on the back of the sheet the fullest example of a psalm in which all creatures are called upon to praise their Creator. The psalm begins with the angels, and it descends, as it were, spatially through the heavenly bodies and the weather to the creatures of earth, and reaches us humans only at the end of the whole movement. Now, I don't think that makes us inferior to all the other creatures, but it does give us a sense, I think, of a whole cosmos of creatures already glorifying God before we ourselves join in. The worship of God is something that's going on in the whole of God's creation. We are called to join in that great chorus of creation's worship. And I think the psalm can be read to suggest that the worship of the other creatures assists our own worship. But the really key point, I think, implicit in these depictions of the worship of creation, that is, creation's worship of God, is the intrinsic value of all creatures. The intrinsic value of all creatures in the theocentric sense of the value given them by their Creator and offered back to Him in praise. In this sense, our place is beside our fellow creatures as fellow worshippers. In the praise in which we gratefully confess ourselves creatures of God, there is no place for hierarchy. Creatureliness levels us all before the otherness of God the Creator. It would be very good, I think, if we could restore to our Christian worship something that was more common in the Christianity of the past, ways of consciously situating our own worship within the worship that all our fellow creatures constantly give to God. I don't know whether in the Lutheran tradition you use the Benedicite, which is the passage from the apocryphal Daniel, which is kind of a long expansion of Psalm 148, calling on all the creatures one by one to worship God. It used to be used in Anglican liturgy. It's fallen out of use, actually just at the time when I think we most of all need it. Nothing, I think, could better restore our sense of creatureliness and our recognition that the rest of the creation is not mere material for us to use by making it into something more useful to us, but a creation that exists for the glory of God, as we also are called to do. Thank you.